8,000 of the most battle-hardened soldiers on earth. Veterans who had crushed Napoleon's finest armies across Europe. They marched toward a swamp, and walked straight into the deadliest trap in American military history. In less than 30 minutes, over 2,000 of them were dead, wounded, or gone. What happened at New Orleans on January 8, 1815, will haunt the British Army forever. The Empire strikes south. Britain's grand ambition. The year was 1814. Napoleon Bonaparte, the terror of Europe, had finally been defeated. France surrendered. The continent breathed. And across the English Channel, the British Empire turned its gaze westward. For 2 years, Britain had been fighting a frustrating war against the young United States, a conflict known as the War of 1812. It had not gone well. The Americans were scrappy, unpredictable, and stubbornly difficult to crush. The British had burned Washington, D.C. to ashes, they had even set fire to the White House itself, and yet the Americans refused to submit. The war dragged on. But now, with Napoleon finished and thousands of Wellington's elite veterans suddenly freed from European battlefields, Britain saw its opportunity. A chance to deal a decisive, humiliating blow. A chance to seize the most strategically valuable city in North America. New Orleans. Sitting at the mouth of the mighty Mississippi River, New Orleans was the economic heartbeat of an entire continent. Whoever controlled New Orleans controlled the river. Whoever controlled the river controlled the trade routes, the agriculture, the lifeblood of the American interior. If Britain could take New Orleans, they could strangle the young United States, and potentially reclaim or reshape the vast Louisiana territory that America had purchased from France just a decade earlier. It was an audacious plan. A brilliant plan. And the British were supremely confident it would work. They assembled a fleet of more than 50 warships and filled them with over 8,000 soldiers, veterans of the Peninsular War against Napoleon. These were not raw recruits. These were hardened professionals who had marched across Spain, fought in the mountains of Portugal, and faced the best armies Europe had to offer. They were led by Major General Sir Edward Pakenham, the brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington himself. Brave. Experienced. Supremely capable. They sailed into the Gulf of Mexico in the autumn of 1814, confident in their superiority. Confident that the ragged American defenses would crumble. Confident that New Orleans would fall before Christmas. They were wrong. Terribly, catastrophically wrong. The man called Old Hickory. Andrew Jackson arrives. While the British fleet sailed toward Louisiana, one man stood between the Empire and New Orleans. And he was not the kind of man who bent easily. Major General Andrew Jackson. They called him Old Hickory, a nickname earned because he was said to be as tough as hickory wood. And those who knew him would tell you the name was accurate. Jackson had survived a childhood of brutal hardship. He had fought in the Revolutionary War as a boy of 13. A British officer had slashed his hand with a sword for refusing to shine his boots, and Jackson carried that scar for the rest of his life, along with a burning, personal hatred for the British that would never fully fade. By 1814, Jackson was a major general in the U.S. Army, fresh from a brutal campaign against the Creek Nation in Alabama. He was lean, fierce, and seemingly indestructible. He suffered from chronic pain. A musket ball was lodged near his heart from a duel years earlier, and yet he never stopped moving, never stopped fighting, never stopped planning. On December 1, 1814, Andrew Jackson rode into New Orleans. The city was in a state of near panic. Rumors swirled. British spies lurked. Some politicians even whispered about surrendering to avoid destruction. Jackson put a stop to that immediately. He declared martial law. He locked the Louisiana legislature's meeting hall and posted guards to prevent any vote on capitulation. He was blunt, brutal, and completely in command. But he faced an almost impossible task. New Orleans had almost no proper military defenses. The city was surrounded by bayous, swamps, lakes, and the wide Mississippi River, terrain that could either protect or destroy depending on who knew how to use it. Jackson had only a few thousand men, and most of them were not regular soldiers. He had Tennessee and Kentucky frontiersmen, Louisiana militia, free men of color, Choctaw warriors, sailors, Marines, New Orleans businessmen who had volunteered, and most remarkably, the pirate Jean Lafitte and his crew of Barratarian privateers. Jean Lafitte, the most famous smuggler and outlaw in the Gulf of Mexico. The British had actually tried to recruit Lafitte first, offering him money and land in exchange for helping them attack New Orleans. Lafitte refused. Instead, he went to the Americans and offered his services. Jackson had initially called Lafitte's men hellish banditti, but he was a practical man. He had heard that Lafitte's men were the finest gunners in the Caribbean, and he needed every gunner he could get. He accepted the offer. Over the next days and weeks, Jackson worked with frantic energy to transform the city into a fortress. He ordered waterways blocked. He placed guns at every approach to the city. And most crucially, he chose a position to make his final stand. 6 miles south of New Orleans, at a place called Chalmette Plantation, lay a dry canal called the Rodriguez Canal. It stretched from the bank of the Mississippi River all the way to a vast cypress swamp on the other side. Jackson recognized it immediately. This natural feature, if properly developed, could create an almost impenetrable defensive line. He put his men to work, soldiers, civilians, enslaved people pressed into labor, digging and building. They piled earth into thick walls. They stacked cotton bales coated with mud as reinforcement. They constructed batteries for cannons at regular intervals. This fortification became known as Line Jackson, a parapet stretching roughly a mile across, protecting New Orleans from a direct land assault. It was not pretty. It was not elegant. But it was exactly what this moment required. The British arrive. Into the Louisiana Labyrinth. The British fleet arrived off the Louisiana coast in mid-December 1814. And almost immediately, they ran into trouble. Getting to New Orleans by land was no simple matter. The region was a maze of lakes, bayous, swamps, and marshes unlike anything the British officers had encountered before. There were no clean roads, no open fields, no straightforward routes of advance. Getting 8,000 soldiers and their heavy equipment from the coast to the outskirts of New Orleans required a logistical nightmare of shallow draft boats, narrow waterways, and punishing physical labor. On December 14, 1814, British naval forces defeated a small American flotilla on Lake Borgne, capturing 5 American gunboats and clearing a path forward. But even after this naval victory, the advance was agonizingly slow and difficult. Soldiers were ferried across the lake in barges and landed in the cold, wet marshes. Officers complained of the mud, the cold, the mosquitoes, the impenetrable vegetation. On December 23, the British advance guard finally reached the edge of the Chalmette Plantation, within striking distance of New Orleans. They were tired, wet, and delayed, but they were close. General Pakenham's plan was simple: push forward, overwhelm the defenders, take the city. But Andrew Jackson had other ideas. That same night, December 23, Jackson launched a surprise night attack on the British camp. In an era when night battles were considered extraordinarily dangerous and chaotic, Jackson threw half his force into the darkness and struck the British while they were still getting organized. The attack was fierce, bloody, and confusing. The British were rattled. Casualties fell on both sides. When dawn came, Jackson withdrew his forces to a stronger position. It was not a decisive victory. But it was a crucial warning shot. It told the British something important: these Americans were not going to run. They were not going to surrender. They were going to fight. Pakenham ordered a halt and began planning his assault more carefully. The chess match. Artillery duels and growing dread. Through the last days of December and the first days of January, a tense chess match played out in the Louisiana mud. On New Year's Day, 1815, the British opened a massive artillery bombardment against Line Jackson, dozens of cannons hurling iron balls at the American earthworks. It seemed, from a distance, overwhelming. The British gunners were skilled professionals. The barrage was intense. But something unexpected happened. Jackson's gunners, including Lafitte's Barratarian pirates at the guns, fired back. And they fired better. The Americans were not supposed to be skilled artillerists. But they were. The British cannon fire began to slacken. Then it stopped. The British gunners had run out of ammunition after just 3 hours. 3 hours. And the American guns were still firing. Pakenham was stunned. He ordered his cannon pulled back out of range. He retreated. He waited. Meanwhile, Jackson's defenses grew stronger by the day. More reinforcements arrived. Over 2,300 Kentucky militiamen reached the city in early January, though many lacked weapons and proper clothing. Still, they added bodies, and Jackson used them. Line Jackson became deeper, sturdier, more formidable. More cannon were positioned. More supplies were brought up. The British sat in their cold, wet camp and watched the American defenses grow stronger while their own men suffered in the Louisiana winter. Sickness spread through the camp. Morale fluctuated. The swamps and bayous that surrounded them were alien and hostile. Soldiers who had marched triumphantly through Spain felt trapped and confused in this strange American wilderness. Pakenham, however, was not a man to give up. Fresh reinforcements arrived for the British as well, Lambert's brigade, bringing the British total to over 8,000 men. Pakenham looked at his numbers and made a decision. On January 8, 1815, he would launch a major frontal assault on Line Jackson. An overwhelming, direct attack with his full strength. The Americans, perhaps 4,000 defenders, would be crushed beneath the sheer weight of British numbers and professionalism. It was, by conventional military thinking of the era, a reasonable plan. In European warfare, disciplined infantry could often storm field fortifications through sheer courage and momentum. But this was not Europe. The trap closes. January 8, 1815, the day of reckoning. The night of January 7 was tense in both camps. On the British side, Pakenham's officers briefed their men. Columns were organized. The plan was laid out. General Samuel Gibbs would lead the main assault against the American left center. General John Keane would attack on the British left. A secondary force would cross the Mississippi to attack the American position on the other bank. It was to be a coordinated, overwhelming strike. The British soldiers prepared themselves. Many of them veterans who had faced French cannon at Badajos, Salamanca, and Vitoria. Some were nervous. Some were quietly confident. But almost all were professional enough to follow orders, no matter their personal feelings. Across the Rodriguez Canal, Andrew Jackson walked his line in the darkness. He moved from battery to battery, speaking to his men. Tennessee sharpshooters crouched behind the earthen parapet, checking their rifles by feel in the darkness. Lafitte's gunners checked their cannon one more time. Free men of color from New Orleans stood shoulder to shoulder with frontier militiamen who had never been east of the Appalachians. It was, by any measure, a strange army. A patchwork. A collection of fighters who had almost nothing in common except the man leading them and the city they were defending. Jackson knew that Line Jackson was their advantage. He also knew something else that Pakenham either didn't know or refused to believe. The terrain in front of his wall was flat, open, and completely exposed. There was nowhere for an attacker to hide. No trees, no ditches, no cover. A man walking toward Line Jackson would be fully visible from the moment he stepped into range. And his men, especially the Kentucky and Tennessee frontiersmen, were not average soldiers. They were hunters. They had spent their entire lives shooting game at long distances, in poor light, in difficult conditions. They were, by the standards of the era, almost supernatural marksmen. As the sky began to lighten on the morning of January 8, a heavy fog lay over the Chalmette fields. Pakenham may have hoped the fog would conceal his men as they advanced. But the Louisiana fog is treacherous. It lifts without warning. At around 6 in the morning, the British columns began to move forward. Almost immediately, things began to go wrong. A critical part of the plan required British engineers to carry ladders and fascines, bundles of sticks, to cross the Rodriguez Canal and scale the American parapet. But when Pakenham rode forward to check on the attack, he discovered to his horror that the men assigned to carry the ladders had left them behind. The assault columns were advancing without the equipment they needed to actually climb the wall. It was a catastrophic oversight. But with thousands of men already in motion, there was no stopping now. The fog began to lift. And the British soldiers, advancing in tight, disciplined columns across the open field, suddenly found themselves fully exposed. Hundreds of yards of flat, bare ground stretched between them and the American line. And from behind that earthen wall, they heard a sound they would never forget. The sound of Andrew Jackson's army opening fire. The storm of fire. 30 minutes of hell. What happened next lasted approximately 30 minutes. In those 30 minutes, the Battle of New Orleans was decided, and military history was forever changed. The American cannon opened first. 8 batteries of artillery, manned by Lafitte's pirates and regular gunners, fired into the advancing British columns. Cannonballs plowed through the tight British formations, cutting down men by the dozen. The British columns compressed, stumbled, reassembled, and kept moving. They were disciplined. They were brave. They had faced cannon fire before. But they had never faced anything quite like this. As the British came within rifle range, roughly 200 to 300 yards, the frontiersmen on Line Jackson opened fire. Kentucky and Tennessee riflemen, loading and firing with practiced speed, poured a storm of lead into the advancing columns. The accuracy was staggering. Men who could hit a squirrel at 200 yards were now aiming at large, slow-moving columns of red-coated soldiers advancing across open ground. Men fell in rows. On the British right, General Samuel Gibbs led his column toward the American left center, the strongest part of the American line. The fire was devastating. Gibbs rode forward, trying to urge his men on, trying to maintain the momentum of the attack. He was struck. Then struck again. Mortally wounded, he was carried from the field. On the British left, General John Keene's column managed to penetrate an unfinished section of the American defenses briefly, but was brought to a grinding halt by the New Orleans Rifles and the 7th U.S. Infantry. Keene himself was wounded. The columns faltered. The men who had crossed Spain without breaking began to waver under the relentless, precise American fire. General Pakenham saw it happening. He saw his attack collapsing. He rode forward, personally, toward the American guns, trying to rally his men by example. It was the act of a brave man. It was also the act of a man who had badly miscalculated. An American volley found him. Sir Edward Pakenham, Major General, brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington, commander of the British forces at New Orleans, fell from his horse, mortally wounded. He died shortly after being carried from the field. His second-in-command, General Gibbs, was already dying. General Keene was wounded. The British command structure had been devastated in less than 30 minutes. The columns broke. Men who had never run from a French army turned and fled across the Chalmette fields, away from the roaring American line. Survivors scrambled back to the relative safety of the British camp. Officers tried to reform their men, tried to organize a second assault. But the heart had gone out of the attack. The losses were catastrophic. 2,034 British soldiers were killed, wounded, missing, or captured in roughly 30 minutes of combat. 2,000 men. Against an American force that suffered just 62 casualties total. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. General Lambert, now commanding what remained of the British force, had no choice. He ordered a full withdrawal. The aftermath. Old Hickory triumphant. The guns fell silent over Chalmette Plantation. The smoke drifted away. And Andrew Jackson's men looked out over a field that told the full story of what had just happened. British dead and wounded lay across hundreds of yards of open ground. The grass was red. The fog was gone. The sun came up over Louisiana on one of the most complete military victories in American history. Jackson was, by all accounts, stunned by the magnitude of what had occurred. He walked his line, spoke to his men, inspected the damage to his earthworks. The parapet had barely been touched. Line Jackson stood almost exactly as it had been built, proof of how completely the British attack had failed even to reach the American defenses in any meaningful way. Across the field, the British were reeling. Lambert organized a careful, orderly retreat, first to the edge of the plantation, then back through the bayous and marshes toward the coast, retracing the painful route they had taken weeks earlier. The difference was that now they carried their wounded and their shame. On January 21st, Jackson formally addressed his troops one final time at Chalmette. He was full of praise for the frontiersmen, the regulars, the free men of color who had fought brilliantly, the pirates who had manned a gun so skillfully. He would later commend Lafitte's Baratarians as among the finest fighters he had ever commanded. But something else was happening that neither army knew. On December 24, 1814, 2 weeks before the Battle of New Orleans, diplomats in Ghent, Belgium had signed the Treaty of Ghent, formally ending the War of 1812. The war was technically over before the battle was even fought. News traveled slowly in 1815. By ship. By horse. By the time the treaty reached the United States and was ratified by the Senate on February 16, 1815, Andrew Jackson's stunning victory had already electrified the nation. The timing barely mattered. The battle had happened. The blood had been spilled. The British had been defeated. The legend is born. What New Orleans made. The news of the Battle of New Orleans swept through the United States like a thunderclap. After years of a difficult, often embarrassing war, after the burning of Washington, after naval disasters, after political chaos, America had something it desperately needed. A great, unambiguous, overwhelming victory. And a hero. Andrew Jackson became, overnight, one of the most famous men in America. The hero of New Orleans. His face appeared on posters, in newspapers, in pamphlets. Songs were written about him. Parades were held. From 1815 until the Civil War, January 8, the anniversary of the battle, was celebrated across the nation with fireworks and festivities rivaling the 4th of July. The victory had a transformative effect on American culture and politics. The Federalist Party, which had opposed the war and sent representatives to secretly negotiate with Britain, was destroyed, branded as cowards and traitors in the afterglow of Jackson's triumph. The era of good feelings followed, a period of national unity and patriotism. And Andrew Jackson? The battle set him on a path to the White House. 13 years after the Battle of New Orleans, in 1828, Old Hickory became the 7th President of the United States. For the British, the defeat left a deep scar. Over 2,000 casualties in 30 minutes. 3 generals killed or wounded. The cream of Wellington's army, men who had beaten Napoleon's best, humiliated by American militiamen and frontier riflemen behind a wall of mud and cotton bales. It was a defeat that British officers would study, analyze, and argue about for decades. The lesson they drew was painful. Discipline and courage are not enough if your tactical plan is fundamentally flawed. Pakenham had sent his men across open ground, without the equipment they needed to scale the American wall, against an enemy ideally positioned and ideally armed for exactly this kind of battle. The result was inevitable. And in the swamps and bayous of Louisiana, something else had been proven. America, for all its youth and roughness and political messiness, could produce an Andrew Jackson. Could produce a Line Jackson. Could assemble pirates and frontiersmen and free men of color and Choctaw warriors into a force capable of stopping the British Empire cold. The death trap of New Orleans was not built in a day. It was built from courage, desperation, creativity, and the particular genius of a man who had been fighting his whole life and knew better than anyone that the ground you stand on matters just as much as the men beside you. Andrew Jackson chose his ground wisely. The British paid the price. The echoes of Chalmette. Why this battle still matters. 200 years later, the Battle of New Orleans still resonates. Chalmette Battlefield is preserved today as part of the Jean Lafitte National Historical Park and Preserve, a quiet green space southeast of the city where the Rodriguez Canal still runs and the Mississippi still flows nearby. Visitors can walk the ground where British soldiers fell in rows, where American gunners fired with devastating precision, where the fate of a city, and arguably the future shape of North America, was decided in half an hour. Historians continue to debate what would have happened had the British won. Could they have held New Orleans permanently? The Treaty of Ghent had already been signed, but it had not yet been ratified by the United States. A major British victory might have given Britain leverage to renegotiate, to demand territorial concessions, to reshape the boundaries of the young republic. We will never know. Because Pakenham sent his men forward without their ladders. Because the fog lifted at the wrong moment. Because Andrew Jackson chose the Rodriguez Canal. Because Jean Lafitte's gunners were as good as advertised. Because Kentucky riflemen could shoot. History turns on moments like these. On the difference between a general who respects his enemy and one who underestimates them. On the difference between an army that knows its terrain and one that is lost in it. On the morning of January 8, 1815, The British Empire marched 8,000 of its finest soldiers toward a mud wall defended by pirates, frontiersmen, farmers, and freedmen, and the mud wall won. That is the story of Andrew Jackson's New Orleans death trap. That is the story of how a city was saved, a nation was galvanized, and a legend was born.